Hey everybody, and welcome to the Multi-Tenancy Working Group. Today we are going to go over a draft proposal of how we want to move forward to achieve the goals of the working group, which are to get a formal definition of multi-tenancy in Kubernetes. The doc that I'm sharing right now, I will drop a link in chat. And I will send it out on the mailing list as well. It should be open for anyone to hop in and comment on. Cool, so I'm gonna get started. Feel free to ask questions as we go. But basically what we're looking at is having a high-level roadmap, and that roadmap is carved into 3 phases. So the first epic would be to define a secure cluster using existing features. The first steps for that would be to define a secure single tenant cluster so that we have that profile available, and then define a secure soft multi-tenant cluster. Once we have those 2 cluster profile definitions, our next steps would be to share the secure tenant specifications with the Kubernetes bug bounty program. They've asked us to, and they think that that would be very helpful for them in having a more robust way for them to programmatically test. And we would also get peer reviews from other SIGs and start investigating tools like SecComp and AppArmor to improve that. In the future, we would be looking at gathering improvements in feature requests, continuing to socialize with the SIGs, and then feeding those feature requests and improvements into our later plan for hard multi-tenancy. The second epic is developing new features and tools to improve support for multi-tenancy. So once we have that cluster definition, we would be looking at building what we're calling a cluster auditing suite, and those words were picked with care. So this would be a suite that you could run against your cluster to see if it's been configured in a secure multi-tenant way, as according to the secure profile that we've developed. There would also be some work on a multi-tenancy CRD, and then also work on looking at multi-tenant monitoring. So being able to tag various namespaces for the tenant so that there isn't different tenants' data showing up in monitoring solutions. In the future, we would continue to gather improvements and feature requests, socialize those with the SIGs, and then feed what we learn into our plan for both soft and hard multi-tenancy in the future. And then finally, our goal is to support hard multi-tenancy, and where we are will be just gathering requirements and feature requests and starting to triage those and decide exactly how we want to go about attacking those, and then put together a roadmap for that in the future that we can share with API machinery and sig-auth, continue to gather feedback, and then put together a concrete project plan. So this is the high level of this doc as far as just what we see the near-term goals of this working group being. And then you'll see a very detailed plan later in this doc. And what I'm hoping we can do is have people start to volunteer to work on different aspects of this project plan, and we can break into small groups and start iterating and really start to make some concrete progress. Cool. So what is our motivation? What are we trying to do here? So what we're looking to do is define best practices in a reference architecture that allows a consumer of our recommendations to create a multi-tenant cluster to provide as a service to their users. A Kubernetes cluster sometimes needs to be shared among multiple users and or applications. In an enterprise, this may look like multiple teams deploying applications to the same Kubernetes cluster. For a service provider, this may be multiple different end customers with deployments managed by the same Kubernetes cluster. There's benefits to sharing, including manageability, reduced cluster sprawl, improved resource utilization, and these benefits may become more significant as the industry moves to deploying containers on bare metal, since many teams don't want to pay for a control plane per deployed application. And then we just kind of wanted to call out that this working group absolutely sees benefits in cluster API, cluster federation. We don't see multi-tenancy as the one solution to rule all solutions. We think that there's a place for all of these technologies working together, depending on what your deployment scenario is, and that adopting Kubernetes at scale requires a comprehensive set of configurations and practices working together. So yeah, we think all of those projects are awesome too. Here you will see that we have defined a tenant. And so we have some comments already on this, but what we're doing is we're defining what we mean by tenants in terms of a functional specification of the business value provided by tenancy. What we want to do with this is avoid ambiguity and make it easier to reason about whether a proposed solution meets these functional requirements. So a tenant is a client of a bounded and isolated amount of compute, storage, networking, and control plane resources within a Kubernetes cluster. These compute boundaries can be defined by the following: resource limits, so that could be CPU, memory, network bandwidth, IO bandwidth, request rates to APIs. There could be optional resource reservations, which ensure minimum resource availability for deploying pods with guaranteed quality of service. And I think we're going to work on that bullet point. An exclusive control plane domain to allow for grouping of resources owned by the client and to limit the control plane read-write access to only resources within the domain. Authentication to ensure that access to the control plane domain is secured, and limited visibility or access to APIs and/or cluster resources outside the control plane domain. This definition is not attempting to reason about implementation details, such as the degree of network, compute, storage, or control plane isolation between tenants, or the methods of implementation, and that we will leave to the subcategories of multi-tenancy, such as the distinction we currently have between hard and soft multi-tenancy. We're gathering use cases, personas, and user stories, and I think that this part of the document will absolutely evolve, and I'd really like to invite everybody to add their own here so that we can continue to kind of grow this document. These are just sort of a starting point. So use cases that we're thinking about right now include enterprises sharing a Kubernetes cluster in their public or private cloud between multiple teams of employees, enterprises sharing a Kubernetes cluster in their public or private cloud between stages of a workload's deployment lifecycle, service provider providing software as a service to end users which runs on a Kubernetes cluster, and a cloud provider using Kubernetes to manage Kubernetes as a service provided to external customers. And that's what we call the Coke and Pepsi model.
Tasha, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Would it make sense to have a table reflecting that definition, right? I think this definition is cool, that resource limit, control plane, visibility, including security, to kind of apply that sort of a table into this use case where we talk about the use case and they say resource isolation, yes, no, how much or something, so that at a glance, we can figure out, okay, which use case, which, cares about which aspect of the definition of the tenant.
Yeah, that would be an awesome addition. I would, I'm happy to give you write access if you'd like to throw that in.
Yeah, I can definitely try that and, get everyone's feedback as well. So thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Yoshi.
Yep.
So personas that we've been talking about have been cluster administrator, tenant administrator, workload developer, operator. Again, super open to adding more personas here and adding more description around the personas that we're thinking about. We also have some user stories, and so so these are again kind of the beginning. So let's gather more user stories from the community and throw them in here so that we're really thinking about the scope of the people that we're serving here. But here we have, as a workload DevOps, I need to know if my Kubernetes cluster is configured to provide secure isolation between untrusted users and applications so that I can assure the business that my API resources can't be read or written by other tenants. There are no information leaks through shared components. My resource objects don't collide with other tenants. Malicious tenants can't intercept my network traffic or access my stored data. Malicious tenants can't infect my application via compromising the hosts. and other applications won't denial of service or impact my access to resources. As a cluster admin, I need to be able to set up my cluster to provide services to my teams that are working independently. And as a cluster administrator, I need to allow different versions of the same resource on a multi-tenant Kubernetes cluster so that tenants can manage their dependencies independently. We have a brief definition of soft and hard multi-tenancy. For soft multi-tenancy, which is what we're focusing on in our initial sprint, we have soft multi-tenancy as the model of multi-tenancy in which users of a shared cluster are trusted to have an incentive to behave as good actors on the system. Tenants should not have access to anything from other tenants, but it would be acceptable to share the Kubernetes API, for example. And then hard multi-tenancy is the model of multi-tenancy in which there's zero trust between users of a shared cluster to behave as good actors on the system. Tenants should not have access to anything from other tenants except for the Kubernetes API, which must be protected, but should still be accessible to allow tenants users to run their own controllers and operators and take access on objects within their namespaces. And I think there may be some back and forth about the access to the Kubernetes API that we should explore, but this is the high-level definitions that we're going with right now, and very open to feedback and comment. FAQs, I only have one FAQ right now, but I'm sure we can add more. One is just what are the vulnerabilities that still remain if I follow these recommendations? For this working group, it is out of scope to try and identify vulnerabilities in Kubernetes, and this is a set of best practices put together from the experience of the broader community. We will be giving these best practices as a reference architecture to the security researchers who are working on Kubernetes bug bounty and use what they find to improve the project. Design principles, these are again like just the beginning. We may want to add more design principles, but number one is all tools and documentation are to be designed and built in a provider agnostic manner. For tools and documentation that could be enhanced with provider specific information, there will be the ability for those providers to add an addendum for their users. And we are beginning with Kubernetes as it is today and providing pragmatic tool sets that can help operators immediately. And we're going to use what we learned through this exercise to inform a broader roadmap for what features need to be added to the upstream Kubernetes projects. This is a project plan that goes into more detail about all of the sort of high-level action items that I described earlier. I won't read through this to everybody today, but I do encourage everyone to read it and see if there are things here that you want to start engaging with, and we can start getting it started. But basically at a high level, step one is we just need a baseline security profile today for a single tenant cluster using the current release of Kubernetes. Assuming the entire cluster is used by a single team, there's no multi-tenancy, and document this baseline security profile to run a secure cluster. For number two, we then will do the same, so baseline security profile for a soft multi-tenant cluster, and then we'll provide these two templates or these two profiles to the security researchers for the bug bounty, get feedback from both them and from other SIGs and from the community, and continue to improve these. As we do that, we anticipate that we'll learn a lot that we can feed directly into our own roadmap and the roadmap of various SIGs. We also want to document which popular ecosystem tools don't work when we have a multi-tenant cluster profile or a secure cluster profile, so that we can start to understand what, like basically encourage the community to think about operating in this model, which they'll have more incentive to do as more people are following it. Additionally, we want to investigate SecComp and AppArmor and look at those profiles and see what would be reasonable to include in a baseline profile. Once we have gotten to this step, then we're ready to add new abstractions, features, and tools to configure and enforce multi-tenancy on a Kubernetes cluster. Again, this is still focusing on the soft multi-tenancy. So we want to create a cluster auditing suite. We want to create a multi-tenancy custom resource definition set. And then we want to look for common patterns in Kubernetes for monitoring multi-tenancy. And more deeply understand how we should be providing data to those monitoring solutions in a multi-tenant and secure manner. Throughout all of this, we want to continue to learn and gather feature requests that we can then feed into our roadmap for hard multi-tenancy, which we anticipate will require working with SIG API machinery, sig-auth, and having some core Kubernetes development work involved. And then finally, we do want to kind of call out this reading list, which has a ton of awesome information that has been developed over the past year of this working group. So if you haven't read this, this is all really valuable information. A lot of it is informing the earlier parts of the document, specifically the security profiles proposal, number 11 and number 12 are going to be very useful resources for when we're putting together the secure profiles. And then we also have already Mike Arpea has written a Kubernetes operator for managing multi-tenant workloads that we could leverage when we get to that part of the project. So yeah, this is overall the project plan that we're looking at doing. We want to open it up to the community and to this working group to see where people want to kind of dive in and participate and help just kind of get started. So definitely, let the group know if you want to start working on parts of this, and we can start making more concrete progress. I'd like to open it up to questions, and I know some people had some user stories and customer use cases that they'd been that they wanted to bring up as well today.
Tasha, this is Sanjeev. So I have several comments, or some related to the doc and some generally on the work. One couple of comments was that when we've got all these user personas and so on, just a clarification to the team that we are not expecting that, for example, we have a persona right now called a tenant administrator, but really the end goal is for it to be self-service, right? So there does not actually eventually need to be a tenant administrator. Tenants should come in and they should be able to self-service, create themselves a new tenant. But for now, just to kind of phase things, we have drafted some concepts like an explicit tenant administrator persona, just to sort of do some phasing. So that's one brief comment. I was able to talk to a couple of folks that are actually running soft multi-tenancy in production. So if there's interest, I can just briefly share a few notes from that, and maybe I'll be able to capture some of that in the documents as well, and we can have them, document something as well. But is that something that would be of interest for me to briefly describe?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so two customers that happen to be running. There's a lot of people that are running, DIY multi-tenancy solutions right now. Because obviously many of the pieces are already in place. Kubernetes has namespaces, you have RBAC, you have pod security policies, network policies, all of that. So I spoke to one customer. In fact, that was the IT department of Atlassian. And they have done a DIY multi-tenancy solution. And they've done a pretty good job. So they were in favor of this working group sort of formalizing a reference architecture around that. What they have done with the DIY solution is very much similar to the things that we've been sort of initially thinking about here. And also they did do a namespace CRD, so a namespace creator CRD. So, we can take a look at something like that as well as part of our tenant management CRD. What else? The other team that I spoke to was actually using one of the standard vendor products, namely OpenShift, which, as you know, has an extensive set of multi-tenancy solutions. And that one, so there again, they extensively use multi-tenancy. So they were also in favor of the upstream community developing reference models, like what our working group here is doing. Their typical workflow is that they have a tenant provisioning portal, right? A project provisioning portal, so running on top of the Kubernetes cluster. So even though products like OpenShift have explicit objects for tenants, right? There's an explicit object in OpenShift called a project, right? And you can create those objects. You can say OC create new project, right? And that actually creates an OpenShift object called a project, which happens to be an aggregation of a namespace and a certain set of policies and so on. So they essentially have that kind of CRD already in OpenShift. But this customer does not use that. They have a separate provisioning portal, and you go in there and you say, please create me a project with certain characteristics, and then that portal comes back down to the OpenShift cluster and then ends up creating a project. So my point in this is that most people doing some kind of Kubernetes multi-tenancy are more or less thinking of a solution similar to what we've been trying to consolidate here. But I think the concept of self-service project creation is very important. And as we develop that, the precise definition of the CRD for tenant management, we'll need to kind of work through the details on that. Let me see if there was anything else that might be worth sharing here. And I can have them come into one of our calls if we need them to, sort of make a readout to the team. I'll have to check with them if they could do that. One of them is on Australian time, so they may not be able to come at this hour. Let me just make sure I'm not missing anything here. There's some details there on, okay, yeah. So both of them use a combination of pod security policies as well as dynamic admission webhooks. So, for example, dynamic admission control is used for things like preventing namespace clashes or ensuring that different tenants do not create ingress objects for URLs that they shouldn't be creating and things like that. So I think we should expect that a mix of static and dynamic admission control will be needed. This also was another question which I had for the team, which is that if we are initially defining a reference model using pod security policies, that may be okay for on-premise clusters, but for hosted clusters, we cannot really influence hosted providers from enabling pod security policies, for example, because that's a cluster creation time setting that they will need to do. So if anybody from GKE or anybody is on the call, I know Yoshi and Yishui are there, they may want to comment whether if we want to have the solution work even for hosted Kubernetes, then really the only option for admission control there would be dynamic admission control, because we really wouldn't be able to embed any recommended pod security policies into their clusters. So quick question for anybody from GKE or EKS or anyone, is that a fair conclusion that we would have to only use dynamic admission for hosted Kubernetes?
I don't think it's a limitation. So you can still have pod security policy be enabled on GKE.
Is it enabled today?
You can enable. You cannot do that from UI, but you can
cluster. You can create a GKE cluster with pod security enabled.
Yes, you can do that with gcloud command line. It's a beta, so you have to type gcloud beta, and you will see the option from there.
Yeah, and I think from a user perspective, I think as far as let's just be let me just think about from a GKE perspective, because to be more simple, as far as from a user perspective, if the property of the multi-tenancy configuration we're trying to define here can be somehow implemented kind of differently on the on-prem or like GKE, I think it's still sort of okay, like easy to confirm, like secure, policy can be done in beta. Those are kind of implementation details that, we have to be sort of be in charge of. But as far as there's not like an unreasonable requirement or kind of property defined in the working group, I think there's a little bit more kind of a room so that we can actually comply actually.
Sure.
Yep.
And the last thing is, so in terms of specific, in addition to documenting architectures and configurations and reference profiles and so on, in terms of actual code development, so I think Yusui and I briefly talked last week, and really there's like 2 or 3 pieces of work which we need to think a little bit more about, and then maybe we can share in one of the upcoming calls. Although you briefly alluded to it, Tusha, already. One is, so there's this X number of tools that we could be developing. One is an auditing tool for a cluster to check whether it's ready for multi-tenancy. 2 is that CRD and controller logic for actually namespace management. And then 3, we've talked about some conformance testing and so on. So we need to work through that a little bit more, and maybe in one of the upcoming calls we can share that in more detail. Yeah. So sorry, I rambled a little bit, but a bunch of updates from my side. Any questions or thoughts on the customers using multi-tenancy today?
I was curious who you were chatting with from Atlassian.
From Atlassian, it was Anand. We can get them. We can see whether he might be available.
Okay. Thanks.
And then we have a question from.
And for the OpenShift, it was in my own company, my own IT department.
Then we have a question from Simon in chat. Are use cases that do not require direct Kubernetes API access in scope? So Simon, I'm guessing that you are saying, what if I want to lock down the API master and just have tenants running in a namespace with no API access?
Yeah, that's right. So we certainly we inject interesting Kubernetes CRDs in people's individual namespaces, but we then don't provide any direct access to Kubernetes APIs.
Yeah, I think we should gather that as an example of hard multi-tenancy, and think of sort of both hard and soft multi-tenancy as a range of capabilities. And so in some of them, I think people will want to lock down access to the API master entirely. And in some, I think they...
yeah, and sorry, my second question was really around user namespace mapping. So what I do is I run a humongous CI/CD, and we obviously don't want people running images as root, but like it or not, just about every image out there is set to use root by default. And so what are people's thoughts on user namespace mapping? There's actually some pre-existing work there going on in sig-auth, but and it's one of these things where they keep on saying, oh, it's going to be in the next version, but it's actually really critical. And I mean, we'd certainly support that. I just want to make sure that this is the right place to look for support.
So user namespaces are not yet ready for prime time. We have been talking to some of the folks there. So yes, as that feature becomes production ready, that would be part of our reference architecture. But at the moment, user namespaces are not quite ready for secure isolation. So this brings me to another point which I missed mentioning about the customer deployments. In the one case where they were using OpenShift, they basically had only 2 pod security profiles. Either you were a privileged tenant, in which case you pretty much had cluster admin-like privileges, or you were a very restricted tenant, in which you essentially had no root privileges, no privileges at all, and it would be a very so our thought initially would be that we would essentially just recommend multi-tenancy for that case. We wouldn't have a gray area where there would be tenants which would have limited levels of privileges and so on. That kind of gets into a little bit of a gray area. So either you would be as privileged as a cluster admin, or you would be very restricted. And the recommendation would be that if your app has been written to run as root, well, you have to refactor your app for now, because user namespaces doesn't protect you just yet. And yeah, I think there were some other folks that. Anyway, that's my input on that.
Yeah, yeah, it's a critical problem for us, like, because we don't have a choice. People, as I say, there's a gazillion images out there that are set to run as root, and so we end up having to put an additional layer around people's images in order to let them use them, and it's a pain in the butt. So, direct support inside of Kubernetes would be is basically an essential piece for us for multi-tenancy.
Yes, in many of those cases, our job will be to influence the groups that are working on it. We wouldn't directly ourselves be working on user namespaces. Yeah.
Okay, so that would be done within SigNode then?
Yes.
Okay.
But yeah, it would be cool, Simon, if you wanted to write that up and add it to the doc just as a use case so that we're tracking it as well.
Yeah, you bet.
Cool. Any other feedback or comments or questions before we end the call for today? Okay. Again, I encourage people to sign up for working on the secure profiles. We'd love to open this up to a team that can just start iterating on this, and then we can present on progress at our follow-up meetings. Also, if anyone has any other topics they'd like to talk about at our next regular meeting, hit up the mailing list and I will add you to the agenda.
Tasha, sorry for the very late question in this such fundamental, but what was the target timeline that we had in our mind in terms of getting the first draft kind of written? I saw the timeline. It says today for your presentation. What's the sort of a targeted time frame for getting the draft done?
I think I'd like to have the draft done by the next meeting.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. So 2 weeks from today.
Sounds good.
Cool. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Chat soon.